Hello， 大家好，欢迎回到外媒看中国，我是安博然。Volkswagen's chief marketing officer and head of product strategy for China has been deported after testing positive for cannabis and cocaine in Beijing, setting the internet on fire with debate. The 57-year-old executive had just come back from a trip to Thailand, where cannabis use is legal, and was required to take a drug test, which he failed. He was then detained before being deported from the country. China has zero tolerance for illicit drug abuse in the country, and this deportation of a foreign executive goes to show that no one is immune. Some Westerners think that China went too far and that the man shouldn't have been punished since he consumed the drugs overseas. Others argue that cannabis should be legalized and that China is missing out on quality Western talent and tourism. Today, I'll take a deeper look with today's special guest, former British police officer Jerry Gray. This is Reports on China. I'm Andy Borham in Shanghai. Let's get reporting. Jochen Sengpiehl, a senior executive working for Germany's Volkswagen in Beijing since 2022, has been deported from China after testing positive for cannabis and cocaine recently. The 57-year-old was first detained for 10 days after being required to take a drugs test following a trip to Thailand, where cannabis use is legal, but cocaine use is not. This is a major setback for the German car maker, according to Financial Times, who report that Europe's largest automaker has in recent years been losing grip of its decades-old market dominance in China and has announced investments of more than 5 billion euros there to catch up to Chinese competitors, such as BYD. And then they made this hilarious dig at China near the end of their article. Following a series of raids on Western consultancies and the introduction of tougher rules on espionage and state secrets, foreign investors and business people have become increasingly uneasy over their personal safety in China. Well, here's a tip for you. Don't come to China under the influence of illicit drugs. It's that simple. China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson Lin Jian was asked for comment by AFP Wednesday before confirming the man tested positive for cocaine and was detained for 10 days before being deported. Cocaine, of course, remains illegal all over the world. Cannabis use, on the other hand, has become legal in many countries, including the executive's native Germany. But China holds on to its zero-tolerance approach, which will perhaps come as no surprise to anyone familiar with the country's recent history. In July 2019, 9 so-called teachers at an English school in Xuzhou spent 15 days behind bars before being deported after testing positive for illegal substances. Since cannabis use became legal in Thailand in 2022, China has started undertaking random drugs tests on passengers coming from that country, with one local news report stating that 48 Chinese tourists were arrested after failing said tests when they arrived home. Now, some argue that those tourists and the German executive should not be charged with anything since they technically took the drugs overseas. Mirko on Twitter said, "His positive drug test doesn't prove possession or consumption in China. He should be able to appeal if China has a proper law system." But that neglects a major point. You will be under the influence of said drugs for days after taking them, and all that matters, according to Chinese law, is that you tested positive. In fact, the Chinese embassy in Thailand made that point very clear, even without taking into account the executive's cocaine use, noting, "Smoking marijuana or eating food and drinks containing marijuana ingredients will leave traces in biological samples such as urine, blood, saliva, and hair, which will become evidence of drug use violations. Smoking marijuana in Thailand and being detected after returning to China is equivalent to taking drugs in China and will be subject to corresponding legal penalties." So my advice to everyone here is very clear. Regardless of whether or not a certain drug is legal in your country, if you plan to come to China for travel or work, ensure you don't consume it for a decent amount of time before coming here. Now I want to bring in today's special guest, former British police officer Jerry Gray, who's lived in China now for 20 years. Jerry, welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you very much for the invite. Nice to see you again, Andy.
You too. So I thought it might be fun if we took a look at some of the Twitter comments about this story together. So XDE wrote, our home, our rules, obey or F off. Some clowns think they're entitled to abuse our rules and regulations, especially pertaining to drugs. FAFO. And then Zen Surfer complained, that zero tolerance policy is one of the few things that I dislike about China and most of Asia. So I was wondering, Jerry, what are your thoughts on that, and how would you reply to Zen Surfer?
I can see both sides of that argument. For sure, I understand the argument that some Chinese people have, these are our rules, this is our home, you abide by our rules, or you F off. I do get that completely. But I also understand some people coming from more tolerant societies saying, well, why are you so intolerant about what we do outside of your society? So I get that. This whole story is based around a person who took drugs outside of China and then came back to China. Now, the truth is, he would have known for sure that he was doing wrong. We all know this. There is a zero tolerance for drugs, and there's a historical reason, which we'll come to, but we all know that he did wrong. Now, what then happened to him is a bit harsh, but he would have known that those were the consequences, and he would have expected. Now, I don't know about you. You've lived in China a long time too. I've probably entered China and left China probably 150 times since I arrived here 20 years ago. Now, sometimes it's just for an overnight stop in Hong Kong. Sometimes it's a 2 or 3 week holiday, as I'm on now in another country. But I'm always going back. And I'm aware of the fact that if I go back and I smell like drugs, a sniffer dog might pick me up. Or if I go back and I look a little suspicious, the customs guys might pick me up and say, can you just step in here and pee into this jar? Well, that can happen. And I know for a fact that it does happen to some people. So consequently, I know the rules. I'm not taking any drugs. I wouldn't anyway, but even if I was, I wouldn't do so within a week or 10 days or so of going back into China. He would have known that. He couldn't possibly have gone into a role which he had without that information being given to him by someone. So it is China's rules. There are very good reasons for it, which we will discuss, I know. And I think probably I'm more in favor of the guys who say, this is our home. This is what we demand of you. It's like a Japanese person saying, take your shoes off. And an American saying, well, I'm not taking my shoes off because I don't take my shoes off in my own home. Why would I? Well, then you're being rude to the host. So consequently, you do what your host requires of you. So I do tend to veer towards that side, although I must admit it's a little harsh. Bad luck. You know the rules.
Yeah, you make your bed, you lie in it.
Yeah.
Back to the comments. This is an interesting one. An account called Freedom Coalition News said, I disagree with this policy. I'm assuming he was a non-Chinese citizen. In parts of the US, cannabis is legal. So if a US citizen legally smokes cannabis in the US and visits China, he can be detained, arrested, and deported. Yeah. This has a potential chilling effect on tourism, overreach. To which Esmeraldo Fortunato replied, not arrested, just denied entrance. In China, women can walk home alone at 2 a.m. and they're safe. People can leave their bikes unattended with no chains and they won't be stolen. That is a society worth defending. So, Jerry, I wanted to get your opinion on that first comment there, because many online are arguing that the VW executive, and you yourself said it's perhaps a little harsh, shouldn't have been deported because he took those drugs in Thailand. So what are your thoughts on that? And should foreigners living in China, especially senior executives, know better?
Is there a country anywhere in the world where cocaine is legal? I don't know that there is.
I don't think so.
And this guy was not caught smoking weed. He was caught with cocaine in his system. So he's broken the law in Thailand. My understanding from reading just media, and you know my views on media, I'm not always 100%, I'm always 100% skeptical, and I'm not always trusting, but a couple of media reports that I've read have said that he had cocaine and marijuana, and it was the Thai authorities who tipped off the Chinese authorities. Well, if that's the case, China hasn't done anything wrong here. I do 100% agree with the second comment where that person said this is a society worth saving. This is a society worth protecting, because I agree. I came here 20 years ago. There was crime. There were drugs. It was quite possible to go into a KTV and find drugs. It was also just as likely that you'd come out of that KTV without your wallet. So those days are gone now. The situation has changed entirely. And so that is definitely worth defending. Now, as for this person who is saying, well, an American person who doesn't break American laws, had it been just weed and he was smoking weed, yeah, I get that. I do get that people think that this is a little harsh, but people know the rules. There is no excuse for it if you know the rules. Ignorance of the law is not a defense against it, but it is possible to say, well, if that guy didn't know, if it was his first trip to China as a tourist, and he would just have been denied entry and turned around. Now, in the case of this VW executive, he wasn't just denied entry, he was locked up in detention for 10 days. So it was more than arrest. It was what they call administrative detention for 10 days. And that means he served some time in a Chinese lockup, not a prison, but a detention center. And I do think that's a little harsh. I do, but he knew what was coming if he got caught. He must have known that. Everybody here knows this. I don't think I've ever met a person who agrees 100% or disagrees 100%. We all have mixed emotions about it, mixed feelings. But the fact is, those are the rules.
Exactly. And you mentioned before China's recent history. So I want to turn back to that with this comment where Russ Bateman reminded everybody, given that the Western world did its best to destroy China with forced opium sales, it's not exactly surprising that a hard line is taken. He's been in the country long enough to know that, which is basically what you're saying. So, Jerry, I wanted to know, how important do you think that is of a factor? I'm talking about the Opium Wars, obviously, on China's stance on illicit drugs in 2024.
Yeah, I made a comment in the thread of your comments this morning, actually, where I saw somebody, it was someone I commented to yesterday, saying that they thought this was a bit harsh. And I said, well, you need to look at China's history. 150 years ago, China's century of humiliation, which is what they call it, started with the Opium Wars. Opium was being shipped into China in massive numbers, and it was creating a huge problem. At one stage, 27% of all males in China were addicted to opium. Imagine that. 1 in 4 people, more than 1 in 4 people addicted to a drug, a narcotic, which was being imported, legally imported, from Afghanistan and India by the British, by the Americans. You know, we've got Harvard and Yale universities were founded on this money, and a lot of the British legacy money comes from this era where they were trading. So consequently, China has said no, absolutely no. But it didn't stop with the Opium Wars. It continued. It didn't stop in 1911 with the transfer from the Qing dynasty to the Republican era. It stopped in 1949. So 70 years ago, Mao, when they took power, had to clean 20 million drug addicts and get them back on the streets as working people. He had to destroy every single opium field, and it was growing all through the Republican era, all through the Second World War. Opium was growing inside of China. This has been well documented. This is not me making this up. Well documented by several people. Opium was grown in China during the Republican era, and Mao stopped it. And from that day forward, there's been a zero tolerance. That's not to say there's no drugs in China. There are. And if you look hard enough, you can find them. But anyone getting caught is subject to the same laws. It's not about this guy being a foreigner, or in fact, I think because he's a foreigner, he probably got treated a little bit better than he would have done if he was Chinese. They still have the death penalty for drugs. A lady was caught coming in with half a kilo of cannabis the other day. She's facing a death penalty. Cannabis. Now, you can argue that's a bit unfair, that's a bit harsh, and I do agree with that. I agree that any death penalty is a bit harsh. I'm not a believer in it. But again, we go back to the same thing. They have a very good historical reason, and they have laws to prevent going back to that kind of reason. We don't want the free-for-all that exists in some countries where people can get doped and get high or do whatever they want to do because drugs are illegal. So it's not going to happen here in China.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned 1949. Cleaning up those drug dens and drug abuse all across China was one of the first things that happened on the creation of the new China. So that's really interesting. One more comment, Jerry. Heru added, he should be glad that he was dealt with in China by the CCP. He said CCP. Had he been that stupid to do so in Singapore, he might have been detained for up to 10 years, LMFAO. How do you think China's dealt with this?
I'm not sure what Singapore or Indonesia or other countries' laws, where they have very strong zero tolerance laws. I'm not sure what they say about someone arriving in the country with contamination as opposed to arriving in the country with drugs. I'm not sure what the law is about that. China's law is kind of a little overarching in that it says if you arrive with cannabis or any illicit drug, not just cannabis, if you arrive with an illicit drug in your system, you're deemed to be carrying an illicit drug into the country, and therefore you'll be subject to punitive measures.
Very interesting. Jerry Gray, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great topic to talk about, and I'm glad to have the opportunity.
Awesome. And that will be it for today, you guys. But as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Was the VW executive being deported from China a bit too harsh? Should China lighten up a little? And are China's laws about taking illegal drugs overseas before visiting the country fair? Let me know down below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. It really does help the channel. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.